What's up guys, Brian Elliott here, and today I'm finishing out my three-part series on the Sony FX3. And today I'm going to be touching on using the FX3 for live event shooting, what I think about it, how it compares to other older cameras that I've used, etc, etc. As with my other two parts, if you've checked them out, I do have to mention that my top handle broke, and live event shooting is probably where I miss it the most, because having 4 channels of audio would be amazing. I could have my Rode Wireless Go, I could have a shotgun mic on the camera, as well as a different mic, just to give me all sorts of audio to pull from on different channels, and that would be truly fantastic. So once that gets fixed, that's going to be amazing. As in the other two parts, I also want to mention my background comes from using the GH3, GH5, A7 III, Pocket 4K, and FX9 before I moved into the FX3. Now, when it comes to the 3.5mm jack, which is what I have to use since I don't have the top handle for things like the Rode Wireless Go, which a lot of times I will use, it sounds good. Like, I can't fault it in terms of particularly like weddings, or if I'm getting audio for fashion shows or things like that. Like, it sounds perfectly acceptable. I know some people with the FX3 get a weird hissing sound, particularly with like the Rode Wireless Go 2, but I personally have not experienced that. My model seems to work really well, and so I've had no issues at weddings I've shot, or fashion shows I've shot, or other live events. It's been really great, and I really can't say anything really negative about the 3.5mm jack for what it is. Obviously, it's not the most amazing preamps in the world, etc, etc. That's typical for a 3.5mm jack, but for what you get, the audio sounds clear, it sounds crisp, it sounds nice. I'm shooting on the A6600 right now. As you can see, the FX3 back there, but essentially you're getting the same type of audio that you're hearing right here from me in this video out of that 3.5mm jack. I don't hear any difference between the two. So when it comes to lens choices and the autofocus, unlike narrative filmmaking, I'm back to using the Tamron Holy Trinity, the 17-28, 28-75, and the 70-180. By and large, occasionally with the Sigma lenses, but I'm pretty much using autofocus 95 to 100% of the time. Even though autofocus is not always perfect, it's generally better than me in super fast scenarios. That said, in low light, it is not always reliable. I've shot several fashion shows in very low light, and the camera would almost predictably lose autofocus at certain points on the Tamron 70-180 in particular, but even other lenses like the 28-75, the autofocus could be spotty. And I'm talking in really low light situations where, you know, I was at ISO 12,800 or even 25,600, where, you know, I could not really see that much with my eyes. Like, it was really dim. Like, I'd look from the monitor out just to see what was actually happening, and I'd be like, oh wow, that's way darker than what I'm seeing on my monitor. So it's understandable that the autofocus struggles a little bit. But it is something to note that this camera is not going to be the end-all, be-all perfect autofocus in the dark if you're working in low-light weddings or low-light other venues or events. So that's something definitely to keep in mind with this camera. That said, in a little bit more light, the FX3 is wonderful. It can track subjects walking towards you. It can switch subjects really quickly if you've got to, you know, move from subject to subject. You've got your tap to focus that works really well most of the time. And so it's a really great autofocus camera, except in the most extreme of scenarios, as one might expect. Now, when it comes to image quality, this camera is great. For live events, I can give this camera a full thumbs up, you know, again, sharp, detailed. Unlike with cinema, you want generally a more realistic, lifelike image, and so the sharpness is not a problem. and the image just looks really great. If you do want things to look, just a little prettier, so to speak, you can throw on those black pro mists and you're good to go. But even if you're just shooting straight lens without any kind of filter, the image still looks really, really nice and beautiful. Probably the headlining feature of the FX3 when it comes to event shooting is the low light, because you never have control over your lighting. Maybe you're working in a nicely, beautifully lit environment, or maybe you've got almost no light to work with, like the fashion show that I shot the other week in extreme low light, again creating that mood lighting, that ambience. And so I was up at 12,800 ISO, even 25,600 ISO when I did some slow motion stuff. I'm working at those really high ISOs that if I was working with something like the GH5, like forget it. Working with something like the Pocket 4K, forget it. Working with the FX9 even, or the A7 III, they might be acceptable, but they're definitely gonna be noisier. But the FX3, or if you're working with the A7S III, for example, it's gonna look good, like truly good at 12,800. Like I was pretty blown away, because I'm like, I know it'll be fine, but when I got the footage back and looked at it, I'm like, man, this is really, really nice. That was a really pleasant surprise. And even with the 25,600 ISO, the image looked a little bit less detailed because of noise reduction and such, but it still was very, very much in the realm of acceptable. It wasn't ugly footage. It just maybe wasn't as pristine if you compared it to shooting at the lower ISOs, but it's still very usable, very acceptable, much better than you could ever get out of the GH5, the Pocket 4K, etc., at these high ISO values. Very impressive. I'm never really walking into a scenario where I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to capture an image with the FX3. So I mentioned in the other videos about the form factor and how it had some nice things and whatnot, but I feel like for event shooting, the form factor of your camera really, really matters more than anything else, because chances are you're running around with it all day, and with cameras like the Pocket 4K that are just kind of a clunky form factor, or the FX9 that are really heavy, that can get hard on your body. There is no better event camera form factor wise that I've experienced than the GH5, because that in-body image stabilization is amazing. So you can have like the smallest package and not be tired at the end of the day. But the FX3 is definitely the second best, because you have all the amazing features in a body that can be really small. And even if you've got it, rigged up a little bit with a monitor and with handles and stuff, and even on a shoulder rig, it's still pretty small, pretty compact. So if you're running around a wedding venue or another tight venue, you don't have this giant bulky thing that you're trying to work with that's really awkward. And because you do have some level of in-body image stabilization, it's much better than the Pocket 4K in that sense. It's also very modular, as I've mentioned in the other videos. So if you need to have it like all big and rigged up for, say, shooting a wedding ceremony or shooting a fashion show when you're actually like locked in position, it's great for that. But then you can like strip it down real small if you need to like run around and grab action shots and things like that. I'm always, flipping around what I'm using on it to best fit the scenario very quickly, very fast. When it comes to the codecs and file sizes, this is also the scenario where I feel like having all the different options is the biggest win, because live events are usually long. Maybe you're recording like really long takes of a speaker, or you're recording just a lot around a wedding day, or all kinds of stuff at a fashion show. And those files can get massive if you're shooting on like the Pocket 4K or the FX9, things like that. And you've got all these options depending on how small you want the file sizes, what you want to work with, things that are pretty manageable while maintaining a 422 10-bit color depth, which is amazing for working with post-production. Really, for live event shooting, I don't have anything really bad to say about the FX3. Sure, it would be lovely if it had the internal NDs, so if you went outside and then back inside, you could switch that real fast. but you know, a variable ND pretty much fixes that. If you can just keep it in your pocket, switch it on, switch it off, you're not going to be losing out on too much time. That's really the only maybe negative I could knock for it, but when you consider that it can basically shoot almost in the dark in really low light, do really well in bright scenarios, especially if you have the XLR handle undamaged, a lot of wonderful options for capturing great audio, really good autofocus in all but the darkest of situations. There's really no camera quite like the FX3 that just does basically everything I need it to do. And really the only close competitor is its bigger brother, the FX6, which is pretty wild. So hope that you guys enjoyed this. Hope that you enjoyed this little series. If you did, please consider subscribing, because I'll definitely have more camera content, more live events, more fashion, more short films, more corporate work, just kind of everything that's been a part of this series. There's gonna be a lot more of that kind of stuff coming out. So consider subscribing, and I will catch all of you in the next video.